Moving on to our next concept that we're to cover here, sexuality. This one is perhaps a little more obvious, right? These are thoughts, desires, behaviors, and practices that are understood as sexual or erotic, right? How an individual or society might determine that certain, oops, I didn't mean to click that quite yet, um, um, uh, practices or behaviors are sexual. Now, it's important to note that sex, gender, and sexuality, all of these three things are related, right? They kind of overlap, but they're also distinct in the social sciences. So again, sex is almost more like the physical or biological. Gender is determined very much by culture, right? And sexuality is, again, those thoughts, desires, and behaviors and practices, right? That an individual will experience as sexual or erotic. Okay. Now I'd like for us to shift to thinking about feminist anthropology, patriarchy, and power. So feminist anthropology is a subfield within the anthropology, emerges in the 1970s, right, during the second wave feminist movement, which I'm hoping you all know something about. Right? Feminist anthropology tried to explain or understand, right, this worldwide phenomenon of patriarchy. How is it that, or why is it rather, that throughout all of human history or throughout across all cultures, right, men tend to occupy positions of political power, right? Why is it that men have power over women? Why do women occupy a subordinate position in relationship to men? When I say that something is a cross-cultural universal, I mean that is something that exists across all cultures, right? So patriarchy, women's subordinate status, this is a cross-cultural universal. Even among, even among the Mosua, which you watch in the kinship unit in terms of like looking at or thinking about a matriarchy, right? Even there, right, the Mosua is located in the Chinese nation, right? Within China, we know that men have the majority of political power, right? So it might be that you have to zoom out to see how women are subordinated, right? In the case of the Mosua, but even there, we see that, right? Women live under patriarchal rule in some way. So the images in the bottom here are two important books and early pieces in feminist anthropology, which again emerged in the 70s, right? So this brings us again to the question, why is it that women are placed below men on the gender hierarchy cross-culturally? Well, one anthropologist who, and so I guess I have another slide in which I ask you this, why is patriarchy a cross-cultural universal? I'll actually give you a second if you'd like to pause this video and brainstorm on your own in your notes, please go ahead and do that. Well, one anthropologist who attempted to answer that question is Sherry Ortner, who I had the great fortune of meeting several years ago. And she provides an explanation for what she calls, quote, the universal fact of culturally attributed second-class status to women in every society. In other words, she came up with a social theory to try to explain this. She wrote an important article, which I'm not making you read. I'm just going to explain it to you, which asked, are men as to culture as women are to nature? So you're probably a little confused right now thinking, what does that mean, right? Are men as to culture as women are to nature? What do you think she meant by this? Well, what Ortner tries to argue is that men historically have been able to occupy the public domain, right? Whereas women were strapped with domestic duties, right? Men had the privilege to be able to, because of not having to deal with child rearing, that sort of thing, to go out into the world to create and engage in broader publics outside of the home, outside of the domestic sphere. things where we tend to think of culture being occupying. So like, the politics, the arts, these things outside of the home. And women became associated with nature. Okay. Childcare, food preparation, domestic work, all of these things tend to be performed by women cross-culturally. And Ortner referred to this as, quote, a vicious cycle in which women are understood to be closer to nature than men, right? She's not saying that women are closer to nature. She's saying that women, socially people think or stereotype this, have this idea that women are closer to nature because of, quote, aspects of women's situation, right? Whether this is through childbirth, lactation, menstruation, right? The biological aspects of women's bodies tie them to these kind of physical, biological, natural processes that men are sort of freed from having to deal with, right? So again, all of those things make it more difficult, or made it more difficult. Think of hunter-gatherer times, right? Women had to kind of couldn't travel around as easily because they had kids, literally carrying infants and children. So they tended to stay near the home and engage with those kind of duties, which freed men to go out into the public realm to eventually engage in things like politics, right? Whereas women dealt with more household affairs. Also note that in many cultures, menstruation is understood as polluting. So in many religions, Hinduism or Judaism, these are just two examples where women are barred from engaging in certain acts if they are menstruating. So again, here's an example of how women's biological processes prevent them from going out and, say, in Hinduism, engaging in certain pilgrimages. Women who are menstruating or who are able to menstruate are not able to engage in those pilgrimages, rather. Okay. I wanted to show this little image from Lisa here, from the book Lisa. Lisa says, Dad, are you seriously telling me my life isn't worth living without breasts? He says, no, that's not what I mean. But these are things you have to consider. What about kids? What about breastfeeding? Who says that I even want kids? Right? So we have these social pressures or expectations that are placed upon women, again, because of their biological or physical attributes. Okay, I have a second activity that I'd like for you to do on the Google Doc today. This one also involves watching a short clip about sworn virgins in the Balkan region. As you watch the clip, I'd like you to ask yourself, would this topic, the topic being sworn virgins of the Balkans, be of interest primarily to anthropologists studying sex, gender, or sexuality? Right. So again, you'll see as you watch the clip that it kind of touches on all three of these things, but it touches on one more than the others. What is sworn virgin identity really addressing? Sex, gender, or sexuality? Please pick one. There is, it's not a trick question. There's one of these is correct. Put your answer and say why you put it in the Google Doc. So I'll give you a second to watch that clip and then record your response. Okay, so I'm assuming at this point that you've gone ahead and put your response in the Google Doc. So one thing I wanted to briefly note is that the narrator in this film assumes that I think they say lesbianism doesn't exist in Albania. This is an old documentary that's no longer true. You have LGBT activist groups working in Albania. So I just wanted to kind of correct that. And of course, it's important to note that cultures change over time. We see this in Pashka's comment on women's rights in the video, right? How they are increasing or becoming increasingly visible in Albania. And that's also true for, again, LGBT issues in Albania. But what's important to note is that students will often watch this video and assume that the sworn virgin has something to do with, sworn virgin identity has something to do with, say, LGBT identity, right? But that's not necessarily the case as we see here, right? Sworn virgins can be those persons who are identified as children. Like the parents might need a boy to take on to inherit property within the family, and so they might assign a child to take on the role of a sworn virgin. Or a young woman might choose to take on the role of becoming a sworn virgin, right? By, of course, taking this vow of celibacy. It's important to note that the sworn virgin role, which is permanent and institutionalized, allows them to fulfill a specific set of rights and obligations, right? But it only really exists because of the devaluation of women in the rural Balkans, right? Traditional Albanian culture is patriarchal. Historically, and even a little bit still today, it remains a harsh warrior culture in which there were patrilocal lineages. And women were not provided with full social rights. So you had different patrilocal lineages, and sometimes they would fight. These clans would fight with one another to the death. Men would kill off other men from neighboring families, et cetera, to the point where you'd have some families where there are very few, if not, sometimes even no sons left. And that's another reason why the sworn virgin kind of identity came up, because women cannot inherit property historically. But if you were a sworn virgin who became sort of like a man in that culture, you could inherit property. So these blood feuds almost really encouraged the taking up of the practice of identifying as a sworn virgin. Okay. So the sworn virgin here identity is focused primarily on that of gender, because the sworn virgin is a gender role. You have man, woman, and sworn virgin. Okay, so it's obviously sex and sexuality, figure into all of this, but it's primarily talking about gender here. So where is this occurring? Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, southern Serbia, and rural pastoral communities in these areas. Again, women have relatively low status in these societies, and sworn virgin identity requires that people assigned woman or girl at birth take on a male gender role, but it's not the same as they don't become like a man, right? And they are still kind of barred from taking on or doing certain things that men get to do. I'm trying to think. I have some examples here from one of the ethnographies written by Antonia Young, the anthropologist that you saw in that clip. She describes a sworn virgin who was refused a hunting license and membership in the local shooting club because, even though she was an amazing hunter, she was not biologically identified as male at birth, right? So again, while sworn virgins can take on the gender identity of a male, at times they are not given privileges reserved for all biological males. And again, this is not the same as transgender, right? This is about them taking on the role of a sworn virgin, as opposed to, say, identifying as something deeply from an early age. Again, it's a choice that one can make in childhood or adolescence or adulthood, but sometimes it's something that parents pressure their children to take on as well. It gives them certain privileges that women in society do not otherwise have. It allows women to hold property and gain familial inheritance, right? And to enter spaces that only men can enter. So these images on the right here are of the Oda, which is a part of the house in the Balkans, which is similar to like a parlor. This is where you would, if you're a guest, you're visiting someone's home, you in a man, you would be able to enter the Oda to chat and to be entertained, right? So only men can be in that space, and sworn virgins, right? So sworn virgins can also be truck drivers. They can take on jobs that typically only men in that society can take on. Okay, so that's just one. I want to give an example of how in other societies they have different ways of thinking about gender and different gender identities and roles that we might have in the US. Okay. So in the next video, I'm going to explain embodiment and go over the reading for today's class, Ideal by Rebecca Popenow.